unusual Spider is a local purchase somebody bought in an auction. And it was actually a pretty good buy. The color is interesting, and it is correct, and it's original. A lot of love has been given to this car over the years, but the person who just recently acquired it in an auction wanted a few upgrades. One of the things we're doing in this car is we're relocating the battery to the rear. Each car has its own challenges. This particular car, what we did with the relocation kit is we raised it up off of the trunk floor so the tire is accessible to get in and out. We didn't want to put it on the axle hump shelf back there because the battery is fairly tall, and we didn't want to have a difficult time being able to take a battery in and out of the car in future maintenance. We also textured the floors in this car, and we did a lot of rust repairs. When it comes to doing the metal work on the floor, we don't necessarily recommend that you color the floor the same as the exterior of the car, simply because when you go to put in carpet kits or rubber mat kits, it takes a whole lot more stuff to hide the color coming through the fittings, or the fitment, I should say. You got a car that's as bright a color as this, I really don't recommend it, but this is what the customer wanted, and ultimately we have to do what the customer wishes. But just food for thought, if you plan on doing floor repairs and whatnot, it's probably always best served to keep the floors black. That way when you go to put in carpet kits and whatnot, you're not using a ton of materials to hide where the color is showing through. Okay, so this thing came in with a plethora of things that needed to happen. It needed some floor repairs, it needed to be textured, it needed trunk issues resolved, and a few other minor things. But anyway, it's about time for it to head home. During the assembly process, we noticed there were a few problems. If you're messing with the wire in your car, you find spots that are where the wire is hard, where the insulation is bubbled up, or it is flaking off. That means you either have or had electrical issues. This car has had a few of them. Now here's a quick maintenance idea that you might want to think about. Disconnect your battery, take a picture of your fuses if you're not sure where they go, take all the fuses out, take a little bit of sandpaper and clean the surfaces of the contacts on the fuse block, okay? Because what happens is over time, whether you have electrical issues or not, but over time what happens is that corrosion starts to build up on the terminals of the fuse block. When corrosion starts to build up, that means it becomes resistant to current flow. When resistance to current flow happens, bad things happen. Wires start to cook, okay? So it's never a bad idea to clean those surfaces up and make them like new, okay? This car, what we discovered on this is the fuse that is powering all the rear lights. We have power coming out if I sent power through the exit of the fuse, but nothing was flowing through and the fuse wasn't blown. It ended up being that there was just enough corrosion buildup on the actual terminals that current couldn't flow. Okay, so obviously during some point in time that current was being restricted. When it's being restricted, that is when bad things happen to wires. Alright, so this one needs all the contacts on the fuse block cleaned up. Other things we discovered about this car is that the blower motor in this car is completely toast. It is burned up. That fuse was blown. And we found that on the back of the center console that wiring for the blower was disconnected. So obviously somebody knew that it was blown a while ago. This is a really cool tool that I use almost every day when I'm doing electrical. This is an amp probe, or I should say a power probe. Okay, so basically I connect it to the battery. I disconnect the battery from the car though, and I use this to supply power to each individual leg of the car. Okay, and it also has a little mechanical circuit breaker on it. So if I send power through somewhere and it's shorted, it'll trip the breaker. Effectively everything on this car is in functional order to the exception of the blower. It's up to the customer whether he wants to replace that or not. And right now it's not the point. The point is that we were able to conclude the reason that fuse is blown is because the motor is no longer insulated, if you will. Anyhow, if you are somewhat electrical savvy or you have the aptitude, you might want to consider buying one of these. This sets you back a couple $100 bucks, but it is an immensely important tool that you can do so much with, especially if you're really into doing your own repairs. Just an update. Is it all clean? It is clean, you say? It doesn't matter where you're getting them at anymore, but the reproductions of the door limit straps, these roller pins nowadays seem to be either oversized or the vulcanized rubber on the strap is oversized. Either way, what happens is when you try to shut the door the first time, you will bend these. You know, we're already navigating for upgrading them on the GTs, but you don't have that luxury when it comes to the spiders, and that's what these are for. These are for a spider. So, the lesser of two evils. We're putting the plastic roll pin guides on the lathe, we're cutting them down. You make them a little bit smaller so they'll transfer through this. And we tried everything. We tried white lithium grease. We tried just forcing it first and see if it just breaks in. None of these things happen. One thing's certain, if that transaction between the roller and the strap is too tight, this vulcanized, and we're not going to call it rubber because it's not rubber anymore, this vulcanized plastic stuff is going to break off, especially if you live in adverse weather conditions where it gets cold and hot. A couple of cycles of seasons, that's going to break off if there's too much tension between that and the roller. Alright, so what we're getting in the middle of doing here is something you don't have to put up with. The seal on the bottom of the steering box is past it. It's leaking, it's coating everything, it's burning on the exhaust. There's no reason to put up with that. Nowadays they've made replacement seals and it's easy enough to change them out. One thing you need to do though, is if you're going to do this, make sure you mark the pitman arm on the steering box in relationship to where it's splined at on the steering box. So when you separate those two and go to put them back together, you put them back in the same exact place. But other than that, the seal that's leaking is right underneath. So we got our little catch can for anything that's left. There you go. Well, to a degree, we're kind of lucky. We're not dumping a lot of gear oil everywhere. I guess if anything, it tells you how bad the leak was. It's probably bone dry. This is one of those cases I'm happy that is. I've had this stuff land all over me. Ruined really cool jackets. Now, if you didn't know, there are two different types of seals. There's the ZF style, and then there's the Berman style. Okay? Because I'm dealing with the Berman box, obviously I'm going to use my Berman seals. Okay, but don't get ahead of yourself. If you got to do this, it's not a bad thing to do. It's pretty easy. But if you got to do it, make sure that it is incredibly clean, because when you put that new seal in there, if there's dirt and grime in there, it's probably going to keep that seal from actually secreting out into the walls and making a leak-proof situation. Really easy to ruin one too. Shooting a little wax and grease remover in there just to get the surface really clean. Because the steering box sits on an angle like that, the sediment is always going to be towards the front. You gotta make sure you got that area really good. Right now I'm seeing a few small metal shavings and debris like that in there. If I were to put a seal in there right now, it wouldn't do anything. It would just leak again. So this is why you gotta be patient and a little methodical and clean it really well. getting pretty good. I'll show you. Alright, so because I'm working on a Berman box, I'm going to use a Berman box seal. The Berman box seal is pretty much measurable difference smaller than a ZF seal. So if you're going to replace the seal in your car, make darn sure you know which one you got. Now, this is simple enough to put in. All I'm going to do is I'm going to put a socket that is just as big as this on it and just mildly tap it with a mallet into place. But before I do that, I'm going to lube the sides of this just so it goes on without pinching or dragging and destroying the seal. Okay, I put a super light coat of white lithium on the exterior of this. The intent is to make it a little less resistant to go back on. And I grabbed an 1 1/8" socket that clears the splines so I can drive it on very carefully. Okay, now it's partially seated. And that's it. It's on. Alright, so we put the pitman arm back on, matched it up to our mark so we know the wheels won't be out of alignment. And now we're going ahead and we're going to put the nut back on. Put the nuts and anything you can into the parts washer and clean them up just so we're not putting greasy stuff back on the car. Now, I'm using a 1/2" impact driver. This is a very powerful tool. I don't want to beat the heck out of the steering box, because after all it is just an aluminum steering box. So I'm throttling down to half power to get that pitman arm to seat. Pitman arm's all the way up against the splines. I can feel it. We'll double check that I got clearance from my cotter pin, which I do, and we'll put a new cotter pin in and that's it. Alright, so putting in a new cotter pin. Yes, there is a right way and a wrong way of doing that. There's never a justifiable reason to reuse a cotter pin. They're not meant to be reused. Okay, once you bend the pin around, you're supposed to take a punch and put it into one of the slots of the castle nut and distort it back the other way. That is actually the textbook way of doing things. Okay, here we are doing another heater box. There's two things we're doing on this heater box. We changed out the fan motor because it's shorted. Somebody's been inside this thing once before though, so I have no idea what we're going to get into. Also, we're changing out the heater valve. They are notorious for seizing. Whether you have the aluminum on plastic, the aluminum on aluminum, or the all plastic one, they all tend to seem to seize at some point. And it's also an opportunity for you to clean your heater core. You'd be amazed what I found inside of heater cores. Yep, the motor's pretty jammed. We'll find out what we got. Okay, so we got the motor out. Make sure you don't lose the isolator blocks. New motors don't come with them. Anyway, that's pretty seized up. Mostly it's because of right here. What happens is a lot of moisture sits in the bottom of this, and eventually it shorts the wires out. I can see right now these wires are fused together. When you have wires that are hard and brittle like this, that's called insulation degradation. It means that they're cooking. And there's just nothing I can do to save that. So we're going to change it out. New one came with blocks. Who would have thunk it? Before you get too far, you always want to make sure that rotates without scrubbing. I can't tell you how many times I put all this together and found out that was scrubbing. Alright, so we got the new blower assembly in there and the new valve. And we set the valve to the limit so we know that it's good to go. So before you go putting this in there, you always want to test it. You want to test it for rubbing and for operations. I cannot tell you how difficult and frustrating it is if you're wrong. A little bit of rubbing, but it usually does what you're doing. So, that's one speed. No speed. That's good. Okay, so we're going to set the fan speed away a little bit. Alright, move the fan blade up a little bit. Nice and smooth. Now I can put it back in and not worry about it. One next thing off the list.